don't trust the Epstein files? At least that's what the New York Times editorial board is suddenly saying. They wrote in part yesterday, quote, "We want to emphasize that we are conflicted about the release of the files. Investigative materials are not normally part of the public record for a reason. They typically include a mixture of facts, speculation, and false leads, and can unfairly damage reputations. The material can sometimes hurt victims." It seems like the board may have had a different headline than what you currently see on the screen, as their Google SEO headline read, "Don't trust the Epstein files." The board continued, writing, "There's every reason to believe that the Trump administration will exploit the process to protect any of its allies' names in the files, starting with the president himself, and to embarrass Democrats and other perceived Trump enemies. Congress should be ready to defy Mr. Trump on this subject again and investigate the Justice Department's handling of the release." President Trump signed legislation in November that calls on the DOJ to release the files by December 19th. Earlier this year, he had been a fierce critic of the fact that the whole Epstein saga remained a huge story. He even called it, quote, "a Democrat hoax," and urged his supporters to move on at one point. They didn't. On Wednesday, House Democrats released photos and videos of Epstein's private island. Upon their release, journalist Michael Tracy downplayed the nature of that, taking to X and writing, "All these fundamentally show is a lush island estate that was apparently kept in immaculate condition. They're like photos from a travel brochure." Now, Tracy has written extensively on various aspects of the Epstein story and has also criticized some of the accuser's claims. And he is my guest today on Rising to discuss it. Michael, it's great to have you back. We talk to you periodically on Rising. I always let viewers know you and I share something in common. We are birthday twins, which is a little fun thing that has you always
birth date, Robbie. You got to be clear about that.
8/8/88.
Not just birthday, birth
Right.
date. Yes.
A very notable birthday indeed. Now, I wanted to talk to you. I enjoyed talking to you about this. We had you on the Two-Way Show.
Just so viewers are aware, Robbie has the incredible misfortune of being like metaphysically bound to me on some level, and there's nothing he can do for the rest of his life to get out of that circumstance.
That's right. We're going to get sucked into some other dimension together one day. But I always enjoy talking to you. You have interesting, kind of all over the board you are one who offends people of all sorts of ideologies for a variety of reasons, and I have always respected that about you. A lot of our viewers have been very invested in the Epstein story for years, as have I, although I too, coming from a very due process and wary of Me Too excesses framework, I had always found it a little odd just automatically extending credibility and faith to people making very provocative claims for which they were paid money to not discuss any longer, and then getting up in stage and saying, we reveal our secret. Well, you already know the secrets. You got millions of dollars not to share them. That doesn't. I can't automatically believe you. But I wonder where we should start here. What do you make of the New York Times claim that we should be wary about releasing some of these things because there could be lies in the Epstein files that are unfairly smearing people's reputations?
Well, just very quickly, you mentioned these self-identified victims who you said got paid money to not make their claims in public any further. That's generally not the case if they had to agree to any provision that would have required them to cease from making public allegations against potential perpetrators of the crimes they claim that they were subject to. That's one of the misconceptions around this. A lot of the women who have been out front making the most salacious claims on the most visible platform never were required to refrain from making those allegations in public, and yet they were still given, in many cases, millions of dollars. But we can get into that. That's one of the most undercovered aspects of this whole story, I think, the incentive structure around these accusations. But as to the New York Times article, yeah, it's bizarre. I don't know if you happen to see it, but I think the initial headline or one of the alternative headlines that the New York Times came up with for that article is "Don't trust the Epstein files." But then on the website now, it's basically an anti-Trump headline because they didn't want to give readers the impression that they had anything but full-fledged faith in the veracity of these files. So they just spun it as something that would impugn Trump. That's like always their go-to little deflection, I guess. But the substantive point that they raise in that editorial is basically correct, which is that it's not customary in any way in fact, it's radically anomalous for the government to just dump en masse the investigatory materials underlying an investigation that they have otherwise said has no basis to continue any further, or that there's no predicate to charge any additional individuals under the auspices of. That's what the FBI and DOJ said in their now infamous memo from July 6th that sparked this latest torrent of outrage around Epstein over the summer and now into the fall and winter, and maybe forever we'll be in the throes of this outrage. So, and why might the government not put out those materials in mass? Well, because let's say they investigate what turns out to be a false lead or a defamatory accusation that wrongly maligns some innocent person as a sex offender or a perpetrator of sex crimes against children in the case of the Epstein uh, story and what many of the high profile claims have been. Now, I happen to personally think, and I've always argued, that this really is an anomalous circumstance where there's a public interest in the need for full and maximum disclosure
Right.
that overrides any consideration to the people that may well, in fact, be wrongly impugned as sex criminals. But if we are actually provided with the genuine full scope of the materials, then responsible journalists and citizens should be able to evaluate that and conclude that, in fact, certain of these accusations were not well founded, if that's what the evidence shows. But a problem here that doesn't get any coverage virtually at all is that both the legislation that's now been passed, and we have the clock ticking for the 30-day deadline for at least ostensibly the full disclosure of all the Epstein files, as provided for in the Thomas Massie Ro Khanna legislation that was passed in November and then signed into law by Trump under strange circumstances. A provision of that bill actually allows for sweeping exceptions to disclosure, right? Or several provisions allow for sweeping exceptions to disclosure. Most prominently, uh, any materials that can be claimed by the Attorney General to be in some sense intertwined with or bearing on the identifying information of self-identified victims, that can be withheld and concealed from the public in perpetuity. And the self-identified victims' lawyers, especially Bradley Edwards, who conferred with Thomas Massie and Ro Khanna in drafting the text of this legislation, have, since the legislation was passed, been on a warpath demanding that extremely strenuous redactions be imposed on any forthcoming records on the grounds of supposedly protecting the privacy interests of victims who just happen to be their clients and just happen to be furnishing them with the basis to actually file additional lawsuits against additional giant financial institutions like Bank of America and Bank of New York, which Bradley Edwards and his colleague David Boies just sued in October.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of, I think, obfuscation going on around the nature of these files and what is actually poised to be released, and what actually some of the loudest advocates nominally of full disclosure Epstein files are trying to keep permanently concealed.
Yeah, that is what started to worry me when I would look into more of those details, or read your reports on some of the claims of these victims who stand on a pedestal and say we're for releasing. Who now you're saying their attorneys are actually arguing against greater disclosure. People who made money and who you say aren't even bound to keep back or not explain what was going on. These are the people who have the evidence that is supposedly in the files and who have profited from very extreme claims that I know you've said in some cases, if you look back, just don't hold up, or are probably in the same category of wealthy people generate fraudulent claims against them all the time and settle them because they have tons of money, and it's easier to write a check for a couple $1,000,000 than go to court, even in a case of where it's egregiously you could prove that the person is making it up. That is a common thing that frankly that conservatives have recognized. The abusive nature of trial attorneys, something they have well recognized in other contexts, absolutely applies here. But you're just not
Ambulance
remembering
chasers,
that.
right? That
Right,
used
the
to be what they
ambulance
would call them.
chasers. That's a Democratic constituency the conservatives have been furious with since I was a child.
Yeah, exactly. So that's obviously, you're right. That has been a long-standing pattern where people of certain means would rather just settle a claim against them and sweep it under the rug or keep it confidential, whatever the veracity of the claim, because it's more prudent for them to simply pay some money and settle rather than undergo a protracted litigation process. But the Epstein case is actually unique in that the opportunities for extremely lavish financial remuneration are much more plentiful than just your standard situation where a rich guy might have a claim lodged against him by some woman and then chooses to settle, right? There's actually a giant industry that's basically been erected around Epstein that has contributed to this notion that there are over 1,000 victims, right? That's what the FBI and DOJ claimed in their memo in July. You see politicians and journalists and lawyers and others repeating this figure over and over without providing anything close to the substantiation for it or explaining how it was determined that any given individual in that group was a victim. Because let's remember, it used to be customary, at least in criminal law, that a victim is not a victim until they've been adjudicated to have been a victim, right? Until the person that they're accusing of victimizing them is found guilty. And then they're a victim. But now it's all preemptive. Now they're not just victims, but survivors based on literally nothing other than their own say so, which is sort of a strange standard, especially for people on the right to embrace, who I recall during the peak of Me Too emphasizing things like due process, etc. But with Epstein, somehow that all went completely by the wayside. And they also are not cognizant at all, it seems, of this sort of industry, as I mentioned, that's been constructed around this stuff, which is that in the wake of Epstein's death, right, in August of 2019, under disputed or at least somewhat mysterious circumstances in federal custody, uh, multiple extremely lucrative settlement programs were established. First, from his own estate, and Epstein was obviously very wealthy, so he had an estate that was domiciled in the Virgin Islands, U.S. Virgin Islands, that the executors of his estate collaborated with the plaintiff's lawyers to set up a settlement distribution program that was modeled on settlement distribution programs that rose out of events like 9/11, where like the victims of the families of 9/11 victims would sue the property manager of the World Trade Center, or the Penn State Jerry Sandusky scandal
Right.
from 2011, 2012. It was a means by which there could be like a mass distribution of settlement funds to a huge class of self-identified victims, and those settlements are doled out through what was expressly structured as a non-adversarial and confidential process. There was no downside risk to someone making a claim, perhaps embellishing it or dramatizing it to get more money, and then having their claims kept completely anonymous if that's what they chose to do. And then that model was essentially replicated in class action lawsuits that the same lawyers, Bradley Edwards, David Boies et al., filed against the likes of JP Morgan and Deutsche Bank. So just among those three settlement funds, there became available approximately $500 million was available to claimants who could proffer even the most tenuous connection to Jeffrey Epstein or claim even the most peripheral victimization by him. So a lot of times what has happened is women who were, by their own admission, adults at the time of their claimed victimization, they are also expressly eligible for payouts per the terms, the court-approved terms of these settlement programs. So they have oftentimes recast things that they took part in consensually, let's say at age 22 or 24 or something like that, 20. They have recast it through the prism of trafficking, which is a very amorphous concept that prosecutors and lawyers absolutely love because the boundaries of it are ever expansive and can basically encompass anything. Um, and so you have people like this woman, Jess Phillips, who who spoke at both of the press conferences that Thomas Massie and Ro Khanna held in front of the Capitol in September and then again in November. She's the one who announced at the September press conference that she and other survivors were going to hereby compile their own list of Epstein's co-conspirators, like child sex trafficking co-conspirators. And then they were going to hand it over the list to Marjorie Taylor Greene and Thomas Massie, who were then going to read the list on the floor of the House of Representatives, where they'd be protected by the Constitution's speech and debate clause. And then the list was never turned over mysteriously, and nobody bothered to follow up. But Jess Phillips making this claim obviously accelerated or exacerbated the public concern or consternation around this issue, because what do people assume when they hear that there are lists of perpetrators or that there's innumerable Epstein victims who have been preyed upon by Epstein's co-conspirators? They assume in large part that these were sex crimes committed against children. We hear pedophile island constantly as a term. Rape island, Ro Khanna talks about. Child sex trafficking, etc. Those are the popular notions associated with Jeffrey Epstein, right? That's why it's become a household name in such a raging political controversy. But Jess Phillips was an adult. So many, I would hazard to say the vast majority of the victims, quote unquote, that are included in this supposed number of over 1,000 were adults at the time of their claimed victimization. Right. Yes, there are people who are minors who also allege certain things that were improperly done to them by Jeffrey Epstein, but so many of the most high-profile accusers, like Jess Phillips or Teresa Helm, who's on TV constantly, or Liz Stein, who was at all these press conferences, I can name you many, many others, were adults in their 20s at the time of their claimed victimization. So one of my problems with the media coverage of this whole story is that gets totally conflated, right? The adult victims get conflated, the purported adult victims get conflated with the purported child victims, and that feeds into this frenzy around pedophilia, which naturally leads everybody to switch off their critical faculties and just join the moral panic. And I think moral panic tends to be damaging unto itself for just the hysteria that it foments, and especially the civil liberties that it abridges, which has often been the case with the Epstein story, which is yet another thing that's undercovered about this.
I think, I've tried to figure out why this story has so resonated with people really across the ideological spectrum. Obviously, it was a major story for independent-minded and right-leaning people, and now has become something of a Democratic story because they think there's going to be some way to damage Trump in it. In the same way that people have been fascinated and consumed with and seeking some alternate explanation for the Kennedy assassination for 50 years. And I think it's because if you just, like, the facts in a very basic level seem weird, right? It's unusual that the president gets shot, the president is killed, and then the guy who killed him is immediately himself killed after. And that strikes people just on its face as weird. Like, some kind of cover-up seems like not a crazy explanation for that. Wait, what's going on? Oh my God, this doesn't just happen. They just killed the guy who killed him? What happened? And now, 80 years later, we have perfectly satisfying explanations to why that was the sequence of events, but people don't accept that because it was weird. In the case of Epstein, you have someone with a mysterious source of wealth, exorbitantly wealthy, goes to prison under somewhat lenient circumstances in terms of what sex offenders generally face, and then gets out and then continues to associate with incredibly wealthy and powerful and influential people right up until the moment he goes back to prison and then dies under mysterious circumstances. And that series of facts makes people go, okay, there's something going on here. What is the thing? And you're saying, I think acknowledging, well, that seems like on its face a crazy series of occurrences. It's actually all quite explainable if you look at the investigative materials that have already been released.
Yeah, I would say that the vast, vast majority of what people find to be so confounding about the Epstein case is explicable if you actually do a dispassionate assessment of the facts and evidence, which I understand a lot of journalists feel is an antiquated concept at this point, but it's actually possible to do. There's an enormously voluminous record that is available to peruse at one's leisure if one so chooses about this story. I would say about 90% of the reporting and research that I've done on Epstein just in the past few months, although I've been interested for years prior to this, but it's definitely intensified since July. About 90% of what I've done has been based on what's already in the public record. Then there's 10% probably of original reporting. But like, for example, people who want to claim that Epstein's wealth is so unexplained seem simultaneously like, quite uninterested in actually learning what is publicly known about the sources of his wealth.
Hmm.
So, for example, that he was a money manager for some of the wealthiest people in the United States who gave him a portion of their revenues so he could run the financial operations of their business holdings, or if, in the case of Leslie Wexner, for example, according to Ghislaine Maxwell, Epstein drafted the trust fund arrangements for his children and ran his like staffing operation for all of Wexner's holdings. Wexner was the uh, was a multi billionaire in the 1980s and 90s. So adjust for inflation, and then if Epstein earns a certain portion of his yearly revenue, that adds up over time. But you mentioned, so like a lot of people, a lot of this stems from people wanting there to be a mystery, because the perception of an enduring mystery fuels their excitement and intrigue and allows for the constant proffering of all these scandalizing theories and speculations, which is what the podcast circuit runs on, right?
Right.
There are no factual standards whatsoever, basically, on the podcast circuit. So you could just make stuff up or just do like pure speculation that is totally histrionic about anything under the sun. And Epstein is like the perfect story to do that based on perpetually. But you mentioned this weird sort of like ideological convergence or synergy around why Epstein has become such an enduring object of fascination for people on both the left and right. That is true. That's sort of what makes it unique and so persistent in the public imagination. But let's remember, Epstein really did sort of start out as a more left or liberal coded story. If you
Right.
trace the origins of it, at least to 2018, which is when it really burst back on to the um, public agenda, when the Miami Herald published a series of articles by this woman, Julie K. Brown, purporting to blow the lid on this covered up Epstein story about this supposed sweetheart deal that he got in Florida in 2007, 2008. And Julie Brown has said very candidly that the reason why she was motivated to investigate this whole Epstein story in the first place is because she was looking for some story that she could peg to Trump that would reflect badly on Trump. It was an anti-Trump story. If you look at the headline from the first installment of that series of articles, it was like Trump's labor secretary Alex Acosta gave convicted pedophile sweetheart deal or something to that effect, right? And it did stimulate enough outrage and consternation that Alex Acosta did, the labor secretary who was the U.S. attorney for the Southern District of Florida when Epstein was being investigated for the crimes that he was alleged to have committed in Palm Beach. Alex Acosta was the presiding U.S. attorney, and then he was Trump's first labor secretary, so that it became a controversy that dogged the administration for a while, and then Acosta eventually did resign. Julie K. Brown, the author of that Miami Herald series, quotes or credits in part the fervor around Me Too as galvanizing this renewed interest in Epstein. Well, after Epstein died in August of 2019, Judge Berman in New York, astoundingly and totally flouting any aware any mindfulness of due
Yeah.
process whatsoever. I mean, this is another civil liberties abridgment that people are just totally uh, ignorant of. He, after Epstein's death, allowed self-identified victims who had not been adjudicated as victims at all, to just announce themselves as victims and then come to the courthouse and then with the imprimatur of the court, make statements castigating Jeffrey Epstein for having victimized them, even though he was deceased at the time and obviously could not offer any rebuttal or examine any of the other underlying evidence. But in that hearing, if you go look at the transcript, victims said, the self-identified victims say that they're so thankful for Me Too for rejuvenating this interest in Epstein. So that's why it's so ironic that, as the political winds sort of start blowing in a slightly different direction, and Joe Biden comes into power, then Epstein becomes a more right-coded issue, because you have people like Kash Patel bloviating on podcasts with Benny Johnson and people that the FBI under Biden is concealing a, quote, list of pedophiles that they're keeping in a safe under their desks or something, and they could just unveil any time of their choosing, but they're not, because they want to protect Democrat donors and uh, operatives or something, like George Soros or Bill Gates, or whoever the hell they claimed
Yeah.
was going to be implicated. And then it sort of shifts back again now with Trump in power, because Democrats in Congress realize that it's something that they can use as a wedge issue to sort of amplify fissures within MAGA, and they know Trump is really
Right back to where it
angry
started.
about it. So it's like a ping pong ball that goes back and forth,
Yeah.
depending on what the partisan circumstances are. I've likened it to Russiagate, or the Trump Russia story, because if you look at any congressional hearing now, Kash Patel, I think it was in September, testified before the House and Senate for one of his yearly testimonies that are supposed to be around like appropriations for the FBI, right? And I think probably 90% or 85%, some proportion, some absurd proportion like that of questions posed to him by Democrats were about Epstein. Just like if you flash back to like September of 2017, a similar percentage of the Democrats' questions would have been about Robert Mueller, right, or about Russian interference.
We're gonna have to
have a similar utility for them.
Yep, we're going to have to leave it there. Michael Tracy, we really appreciate your time. Very informative, as always. Appreciate you being here.
All right, thanks, Robbie.
Take care. We'll be back with more Rising right after this.